You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. We have made it to my final video about Joel Lineweber's talk at the Dinosaur Convention thing that Answers in Genesis held. It's basically just a repackaging of a post he published in the Answers research blog. The whole point of his talk is to try to show that birds aren't dinosaurs. Instead, all he's done is given reasons why birds are unique among dinosaurs and played word games. Just by redefining a bird to mean not what it has traditionally meant, nor what most paleontologists mean by it when they speak broadly, but the whole of Maniraptora, except when he decides it doesn't mean that. Maniraptora is a group that includes animals that even AIG still portrays as scaly reptiles. He claimed that he was going to give us 7 differences between birds and dinosaurs, and the first four were just traits unique among extant animals to birds, and that are not shared by all dinosaurs. We're picking up with his final 3 such traits. Let's see what he's got for us.
Some of you probably heard the phrase, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then it's a duck, right?
Yup.
And part of the reason for that phrase is because birds walk very differently from dinosaurs and other bipeds.
Just like bats walk differently from mammals.
So, this is a photo of a roadrunner. And have you ever looked at a bird and wondered why its knee bends backwards?
No, because I know how anatomy works, and that those are ankles. The knee on that bird is covered by the wing, so you can't see it. Here's a featherless chicken, where the hind limb anatomy is not hidden by integumentary structures. It's pretty easy to see what's going on there. The thigh is mostly parallel to the spine, and the lower leg extends down with the ankle being about halfway down, followed by the tarsometatarsus, then the actual pedal phalanges.
Well, that's not actually its knee. That's actually the ankle. The knee is up in the body, usually covered by feathers, kind of hidden.
That knee isn't in the body, but yes, it's usually covered by feathers. But if it were in the body, you couldn't see it regardless of the feathers. It's like the bird's intestines. I don't care how many feathers you remove, until you get rid of the skin and muscle wall, you're not going to see the intestines, because they're on the inside. The knees are on the outside, although there is a patagium of skin stretching from the lateral side of the torso to the medial side of the thigh, just like there is in other dinosaurs, like Psittacosaurus, where that exact patagium was preserved in an exquisite skin impression, that also had melanosomes preserved in it, and even protofeathers. Funny how he doesn't seem to want to talk about that, isn't it? And yeah, if you can't tell, I'm getting pretty tired of giving Joel any charity.
And that's because birds are knee walkers.
That doesn't mean anything. Everything with a knee that bends at all walks with its knee. The knee joint provides part of the energy for the stride. How much varies.
Their femur, the first bone in their leg, stays relatively stable, and the rest of their leg moves underneath it.
Are you sure about that?
Here's a bird walking being x-rayed with a 3D overlay of one of its legs. I've certainly seen more femoral movement in a stride, but I've also seen a lot less. Also, since we're talking about femora, why not point out that one of the characteristics of dinosaurs is that they have a femoral head that is distinctly offset from the shaft and faces towards the body medially, such that it can interface with the laterally pointing acetabulum, or hip socket. And the dinosaur femur I've used to demonstrate this fact with is a bird femur. On the other hand, range of motion and neutral position of the femur is not and has never been part of the definition of a dinosaur.
That's why they look so funny when they walk. But dinosaurs, they walked more like people. They're hip walkers, right? The whole leg swings when they walk.
The whole leg swings when birds walk too, and this change in position isn't actually a change in the anatomy of the leg. Look, here's some birds with artificial weights on their back end. Notice when they have a simulated, long, heavy, bony tail, they swing their femora down, and more of the propulsion comes from the knee. That's because bipedal dinosaurs, including birds, all balance at the knee. In most non-avian dinosaurs, this means that their long tail is used as a counterbalance, allowing them to have fairly vertically oriented femora. Birds, by contrast, have short tails that are not very heavy when all is said and done, and also very, very heavy chests, given their flight muscles. So, how can they balance at the knees without this counterbalance? Well, they bring the knee forward. Of course, the only way to change the position of the knee relative to the torso is by pivoting the femur at the hip. So the femur comes up, swinging the knee forward, and boom, now we have a stereotypical bird pose. But as you can see, birds can still adopt the more typical dinosaur pose if their weight distribution changes. So this is simply a change of posture, not an actual anatomical difference. It would be like saying that someone isn't a human because they don't sit up straight. This is absolutely meaningless to the question of if birds are dinosaurs or not.
So, what are some things that would help us discern if these feathered maniraptors walked like birds?
The presence of a Pygostyle, the size of the fourth trochanter of the femur, wear patterns on the femoral head and the acetabulum, maybe footprints, although I'm not positive those would really help all that much on this particular question.
Well, one thing is the tail. We mentioned the tail earlier. So it seems like 30 tail vertebrae or fewer is about the threshold for a short tail. And
it's very clear that that number was just picked because that's the number that will let him artificially group together the Maniraptorans in one group to the exclusion of most other theropods. But hey, what if we scale up a Microraptor so that the first caudal vertebrae is the same size as in the Allosaurus? Oh man, would you look at that? The tail is actually longer in Microraptor than in Allosaurus. Okay, but maybe that's not fair. Let's size skeletal reconstructions of both Microraptor and Allosaurus by something other than caudal vertebrae. Let's do scaling to equal femur length. That's a pretty common technique in dinosaur science. Oh, would you look at that? They're basically the same length. It's almost like just counting caudal vertebrae is a dumb idea when it comes to determining if a tail is short or long. An Archaeopteryx actually has a tail that in length is far more like that of an Allosaurus than it is like that of a pigeon after you scale the animals. Based on tail length, there is every reason to think that when simply standing on the ground, Microraptor had its femur mostly perpendicular to the spine, or perhaps somewhere between the near horizontal posture of most birds and the near vertical posture of most non-avian dinosaurs. Before we move on, I want to point out that we generally don't actually have a good count of how many vertebrae are in the tails of most dinosaurs. Caudal vertebrae tend to be among the smallest vertebrae, and tails are some of the most easily damaged parts of an animal post-mortem. As a result, very few dinosaurs are ever found with completely intact tails, so even if this were a reasonable way to divide out short versus long-tailed dinosaurs, we can't reliably do it anyway.
As we look at these animals, you can see Microraptor has 26, Archaeopteryx only has 22, but if you look at some of these dinosaurs, they're up above 40 in most cases.
He said while giving only 2 examples. But whatever, this entire argument is like seeing who has a longer neck by counting cervical vertebrae and then concluding that because chickens have 14 cervical vertebrae, they have longer necks than giraffes, who only have 7.
And they've got these big, long tails because they need a center of balance that's at the hip.
Wrong. It's at the knee.
Because their leg needs to move from the hip.
No, it doesn't. If a non-avian dinosaur had a shortened tail, perhaps because of injury, it could just like a modern bird swing its femora a bit further forward. Granted, birds are better at this because that's their habitual and ancestral posture, but still, this is not even a difference.
And so they need a long tail to balance out their body. But birds, they have a center of balance further forward because they're walking from their knee, and their knee is further forward.
It's like he's trying to get the causation exactly backwards. Both balance at the knee. How far forward or back the knee is at rest and during strides is dependent on where the center of the balance of the body is. And dinosaurs, birds or not, will swing the femur to put the knees over the center of balance. And if you shift the location of that center of balance, either can adjust the knee to compensate.
So, question I'm sure you've all been wondering, can Archaeopteryx walk like a dinosaur?
Yes, because birds do walk like dinosaurs.
You can see that little tail that it's got. If Archaeopteryx tried to walk like a dinosaur, it wouldn't work. It's way off balance, right?
Wrong. That's only even remotely plausible if you pretend that dinosaurs always balanced at their hip, a structure that can't even move relative to the body as a whole, making it basically impossible for that to be how bipedal dinosaurs walked. In order to make something as dynamic as bipedality work from a balance perspective, the point of balance needs to be mobile, because the center of mass of the animal is going to change relative to the axial skeleton. That means that the point of balance for a biped can't simply be hooked to a part of the skeleton that can't significantly change position compared to the bulk of the axial skeleton. That's why the center of balance is at the knees, and the knees adjust position to account for different centers of mass. Even humans face this problem. When standing, the center of gravity of a human runs through basically the center of the pelvis. But when walking, it shifts dynamically as the torso tends to go forward and the arms tend to swing. As a result, the stride has to compensate for this, and one of the key joints for balancing is the knee. Try knocking with a knee brace preventing you from flexing your knee. You'll find it to be a pretty big problem. All Joel is pointing out is that dinosaurs with different centers of gravity and that balance at the knee must have different positions for the femur. This isn't exactly a groundbreaking discovery, nor is it a problem for evolution, nor does it make birds not dinosaurs.
And you'll sometimes see reconstructions of some of these feathered maniraptors that try to pose them like a dinosaur.
I've literally never seen one that didn't, because dinosaurs aren't defined by their pose. Nothing in biology really is. Like, humans don't suddenly become bears if they walk on all fours, and a bear doesn't become a human if it stands on its hind legs and walks a bit. Yet that's kind of the thing that, according to Joel, is not only of taxonomic significance, but of such significance that he can use it to break the other rules of taxonomy. That's completely off-the-wall insane. Joel is either a liar or he knows about as much about taxonomy as the average Rotten Tomato does.
And they make the tail look thicker than it actually was and things like that to try to make it look right, but it doesn't work.
I'm going to need a citation on that one, because there's no way in hell I'm going to take the word of a guy who thought that dislocating the fingers of Microraptor was a good way to demonstrate how you can make it look like a dinosaur. Look, Joel is a talented artist, but it's very clear from his willingness to make up structures we know animals did not have, like beaks, keels, and feathers, that he is not interested in looking at the data, and not contradicting it in his reconstructions. In fact, he will deliberately contradict the data in his reconstructions if that makes him feel better, as we have already seen with Microraptor, Archaeopteryx, and Utahraptor. So when he accuses other people of his own fault, I won't say he's wrong, but I will also say that his accusation means nothing. It's like having Charles Manson accuse you of being a bad guy. I mean, maybe you are a bad guy, but I'm not going to give any weight to Manson's opinion. Similarly, I'm not going to give any weight to Joel's opinion about reconstructions he's not even showing us.
Now, some researchers are kind of thrown off by this because most modern birds have something called a pygostyle.
Yep, it's a fusing of the distalmost caudal vertebrae, and it is the attachment point for the tail fan in birds. Also, it's not most modern birds, it's birds, full stop. And yes, by this I am continuing to use the definition for birds that was requested by Answers in Genesis, members of the taxon Aves.
And it's a shorter tail with a set of fused bones on the end, and these extinct animals, these feathered manoraptors, they have something that's a little bit different from a pygostyle.
Yup, making them not birds, not as I define it, but as Gabriella Haynes, the Pet Answers in Genesis paleontologist, defines it.
But functionally, it's very similar. And you can see the base of the tail is very flexible, but the end of the tail is stiff.
It kind of serves the same purpose in that both are about balance and turning, but the Velociraptor configuration is for running, and the Pygostyle is about flight, in which there is an additional axis to worry about. Roll.
And that adds to their flight ability. It's kind of a flight control that they can use. And the same thing with Microraptor here. It's got an unfused Pygostyle.
An unfused Pygostyle is like an unbrewed beer. It's just not a Pygostyle, and it's not a beer. If I invited you to my place for a beer, and then I threw some barley and hops at you and told you to drink up because it's unbrewed beer, you'd find that unacceptable. The whole point of beer is the brewing. No brewing, no beer. The whole point of a Pygostyle is the bone fusion. No fusion, and no Pygostyle.
But there's still stiffening elements in it. The end of the tail is still stiff, as opposed to the dinosaurs, like the Allosaurus.
Celusaurus? That's not a thing. Celosaurus is a thing, but that's a prosauropod, not anything that's on screen. But even the Allosaurus that is on screen and is labeled as all flexible, which sounds more like an escort ad than an anatomical description, is actually a tetanurine. That means it's a member of Tetanurae, a group whose name means stiff tails. Would you believe me if I told you that all tetanurines have stiff tails and the degree of stiffness varies, with Coelurosaurs having some of the stiffest tails, and among Coelurosaurs, the Maniraptorans having even stiffer tails? It's almost like there's an evolutionary lineage.
It's got that big, thick tail that's flexible all the way down.
And it is stiffened as you go distally, a trend that increases as you get closer phylogenetically to birds.
And this is really important because it's a problem for evolution. If a dinosaur, even if it evolved wings somehow, magically.
Ah yes, as opposed to being poofed into existence via a conjuration spell. The non-magical option.
And tried to fly or tried to soar, it wouldn't work.
Based on so-called flying lemurs, flying frogs, flying snakes, flying squirrels, and flying lizards, all of whom managed to glide with wildly varying anatomy, I doubt this.
It would fall out of the sky.
Joel is a decent artist. Why does he feel the need to show us this AI slop? This is horrible. The shoulders are on backwards, the legs have poorly defined joints, the toes are just abominations. Some of the wing feathers seem to end in claws. There are 2 nostrils on one side of the head. There are simply no fingers. As if I needed another reason to dislike Joel. Answers in Genesis really are a bag of dicks.
Because its center of balance is too far backward. The center of balance needs to be really far forward for flying to even work.
No, it doesn't. The center of mass needs to be forward enough compared to the center of lift that there is stability. The farther forward the center of lift is, the more stable, but less maneuverable the animal or plane will be. Now I wonder if there's some way that you could have a long tail and also push the center of lift back so that the center of mass remains in front of the center of lift. Something like, I don't know, a long tail that provides lift via a tail fan. Or maybe lift-producing feathers on the hind limb. Oh, right. So exactly what Microraptor has. Oops.
It would spiral out. It wouldn't even be able to glide.
No, that's what would happen if you stuck a long flexible tail with no tail fan onto a modern bird, but that's a straw man of the evolution of birds. Instead, they evolved from dinosaurs that already had stiffened tails and tail fans, meaning that they never faced this problem. Evolution doesn't propose that one day an Allosaurus was hatched with wings and that's how birds evolved. Remember, if you have to strawman your opponent in order to argue against them, it's a pretty good indication that they're right and you're wrong.
So, short tail. That's another major difference between dinosaurs and birds.
Wow, even on his own terms, that was a disaster. It's not even a difference. Many of the animals he's called birds had long tails. And notice how he didn't give any numbers? Yeah, that's because he doesn't have any. There's no magical tail length proportional to any other anatomical feature that makes an animal a bird.
So another thing is, again, that knee walking. And we'll illustrate that by looking at our Allosaurus, the skeleton here at the Creation Museum, Ebenezer.
I hate that one of the best Allosaurus skeletons in existence is held captive by pseudoscientists who are buddy-buddy with dominionist cultists. If there were ever a better argument for disallowing the private ownership of at least vertebrate fossils, I don't know one. Interestingly, in most countries, you can't actually own things like this privately. Also, because of the status of this fossil, nicknamed Ebenezer, which is a name I honestly like, it basically can't be studied. In order for a fossil to be studied in paleontology, it must be available for others to study so that the claims can be checked. Private fossils are generally not in this situation since access to them relies on private permission from the owner. The only typical exception to this is when privately owned fossils are temporarily made available at museums. But, real museums, not cultist flat earth adjacent propaganda outlets. The ethical thing to do would be to get careful casts made of Ebenezer and then to donate it to a real museum while keeping a replica on display. But no, the group that wants to outlaw you having a romantic partner they don't approve of and that wants to make it mostly illegal for women to vote gets to own one of the best preserved Allosaurus skeletons in the world. And all they do with it is spread lies. And if you don't think AIG would mostly outlaw women voting, then I'll just say this. Generally, you don't host speakers at a private venue that you find unacceptable. For instance, you're probably not going to find a skinhead convention meeting at a local Jewish center. AIG hosted a convention for Christian dominionists who would, by and large, outlaw women voting if they could.
If you look at that tail, number one, it's really long, like we talked about.
Which is meaningless in this discussion. What's not meaningless is hitting like on this video and subscribing. It actually means a lot to me and to the channel. It's the best way to grow this channel, so please like and subscribe.
But another unique thing about it that we see in dinosaur tails is it's got a lot of large muscle attachments. Look at all those bony processes that go all the way down the length of the tail.
Yep, the typical dinosaur tail has a lot of muscle attachments, but just like the difference in the tail muscle attachments between whales and other mammals don't make whales not mammals, I'm not sure how he's thinking he's going to make a point about this removing birds from dinosaurs.
That's because it's got, scientists think it had a large muscle called the Caudofemoralis longus.
That's true.
It's a characteristic of archosaurs, not just dinosaurs, and birds still have it. That means that birds are archosaurs, which is a requirement if they're dinosaurs. Of course, nothing about the size or importance of the Caudofemoralis longus muscle is diagnostic for dinosaurs. So he's just again going to give us a reason birds are unique among dinosaurs, but not one that they aren't dinosaurs.
And it needed to attach to that tail, and it used that muscle for walking.
Yup, in archosaurs, including dinosaurs, which includes birds, the Caudofemoralis longus muscle is typically the main retractor for the femur.
Because that femur has to move somehow, right? And so there's a muscle attachment on the femur called the fourth trochanter. That big old muscle attaches to the femur, and it pulls the leg back and propels the animal forward.
Hey, did you know that having an asymmetrical fourth trochanter is actually a diagnostic criterion for being a dinosaur, and that birds meet that criterion? Well, now you do.
So there should be evidence of that muscle if it's a dinosaur. If it's a bird, we expect to not see evidence of that muscle.
Well, I've got bad news for Joel. His own paper says birds have a Caudofemoralis, so seems like this is self-defeating.
Well, what do evolutionists say about this? Here's a quote from an evolutionist. In advanced forms such as Oviraptorosaurs, Troodonts, or Dromaeosaurs, many of the modifications toward an avian style of walking had already taken place.
Yep, and Joel's response to things like this so far is to simply redefine birds so that these animals are birds, which doesn't actually mean anything. It's just word games. Let's see if he responds that way again.
So they're saying, they're admitting that these animals, they already walked like birds.
First, there's nothing to admit. Second, that's not what was said. The quote was, many of the modification towards an avian style of walking. Not all the modifications. So Joel is just lying. Also, his source for this is Limb Proportions and Avian Terrestrial Locomotion by Christensen et al., published in the Journal of Ornithology, July 1st, 2002. So this is a bunch of ornithologists who accept that birds are dinosaurs. This is contrary to the creationist claim that ornithologists do not agree that birds are dinosaurs, and that claim is something that comes from paleontologists in opposition to ornithologists. The paper starts with, quote, phylogenetic systematics unanimously concludes that birds, Archaeopteryx plus crowned clade aves, are a subgroup of theropod dinosaurs. The discovery of non-avian theropods from China with large pennaceous feathers offers additional support to this relationship, and implies further that feathers cannot be used to define birds as is traditionally advocated, end quote. Given Joel's previous propensity for just quoting the first sentence or two of papers, it's odd that he didn't do that here. Later, the paper says, quote, the long limbs of Caudofemoralis are not surprising as limb length is related to phylogeny and body size. Primitive non-avian theropods have proportionally shorter limbs at any given size than more advanced forms, and small species have proportionally longer limbs than large species, as in extant mammals. Other theropods are known with proportionally very long limbs. The femoral morphology of Caudofemoralis is identical to those of other non-avian theropods, strongly arguing against avian limb kinematics. Weird. So in fact, Maniraptorans, according to Joel's citation, actually don't walk exactly like birds. In fact, this study claims to have ruled that out. This is a Trojan source.
But they're not birds, they're dinosaurs.
Yes, because as his own source says, the limb proportions and kinematics are more in line with other theropods, and not in line with those of modern avians. Pro tip, if you want to argue for something, don't cite a source that says you're wrong.
Look at the language that they use there. Advanced forms, modifications that had already taken place. That's evolutionary language.
Yeah, imagine that. People using terms that refer to the only operating theory in biology that explains the origin of biodiversity. This is the same as a flat earther complaining that the word atmosphere is biased because it implies the globe. Yeah, it does. Because the globe is the position with all the evidence. Evolution is in the same position. If Joel doesn't like it, he can get the fuck over it and try to actually change the consensus, because until he does, scientists are going to keep doing science with the only theory about this that they have.
And this is all through the research papers. There's some things that are good observational science, and there's a lot of stuff that's just storytelling.
Nothing about that is a story. On the other hand, Genesis is literally a bunch of stories. Talk about special pleading.
So, here's a diagram of that. Again, that muscle that provides that locomotion in a dinosaur. Birds, very different. They have a muscle that has a similar name.
No, it's not just a similar name. It has a similar embryology, and it has the same muscle attachment points on both the tail and the femur. It's the same muscle. It's much smaller and is less important in birds than in other dinosaurs, but it's the same muscle.
But it does the exact opposite.
Not really. Let's think about muscles and what they do. Basically, they contract and relax. They can't push. If you pull your arm up like you're doing a curl, you're contracting your bicep. If you push with the same arm, you're contracting your triceps. When a muscle contracts, it tries to lower the distance between the attachment points. So what's the difference between moving the femur back and the tail down? Well, nothing from the standpoint of the muscle. What happens to the organism depends on what structure is better braced. In most birds, it's the femur, which is braced by pretty much the whole mass of the organism. In most other dinosaurs, it's the tail, which is heavy, dense, and strongly connected to the rest of the axial skeleton and the hips. To show you why these actions are the same thing, let's consider a human example. The previously mentioned biceps. Usually we would say that the thing that biceps does is move your lower arm. But let's say you're in 0G, like on the International Space Station. If you're holding onto some handle and you flex your bicep, your lower arm will stay put and the rest of your body will move. Does that mean that the function of your bicep has changed? Well, in some ways, yes, because now it's controlling the location of your whole body rather than just your lower arm. But in another way, no, it still does the function of bringing the attachment points of the muscle closer together. That's what it always did. This is what is happening here. The Caudofemoralis, whether longus or not, brings the posterior side of the femur closer to the ventral side of the tail. Period. As birds became more and more ankle dominant in walking as a result of their very far forward center of mass, the femur became the more stable point in the skeleton, which means that the same muscle went from mostly moving the femur to mostly moving the tail. This isn't some kind of rocket science or mystery or contradiction in evolution. The whole point of evolution is explaining how organisms change. Pointing out that something changed in a lineage isn't an argument against evolution.
It anchors to the stable femur that's not moving, and it has the ability to help move the tail.
Right, which isn't the opposite as long as you remember what muscles actually are.
So what do we find in these feathered Maniraptors? Well, there's Microraptor. We don't find the big muscle attachment on the femur. We don't find big muscle attachments all down the tail. It just had most likely a small muscle there that provided some tail movement. So they walked like birds.
Which is an odd conclusion since that's not what his source says. But hey, I don't really care since it doesn't really matter either way.
And this is really important for flight as well, because it allows that tail to move separately from the legs. A dinosaur can't do that.
Actually, it doesn't. If both the tail and the femur are unsupported and unbalanced, as in flight, contracting the Caudofemoralis muscle will move both the femur and the tail. It's physically impossible for it not to.
A dinosaur's tail has to stay stable while it's walking or running to give it the power or something to anchor to.
No, dinosaur tails swayed when they were walking specifically because the Caudofemoralis longus was the main femoral retractor. Since the tail isn't rigid at the base, it is again physically impossible for that muscle to contract on one side but not the other, and not sway the tail towards the side of the body on which the femur is going back. This isn't some special evolutionary assumption. This is the basics of, how a lever works. Like, does Joel know what a fulcrum is? A lever arm? If you know what those things are, then you can figure this out. Joel apparently can't.
All right. So we are at 6 major differences between dinosaurs and birds. Short tail, knee walking.
And we're 0 for 6 on reasons birds aren't dinosaurs, and 6 for 6 on reasons why birds are unique among dinosaurs. Let's see if the final one can finally actually be a reason why birds aren't dinosaurs.
Last one, hip structure.
Interesting, because the hips are one of the places where birds are most obviously dinosaurs.
So birds have, you can see the blue bone there, they have a pubic bone that points backwards toward the rear of the animal.
That's true.
Dinosaurs have, in that green bone there, a pubic bone that points forward.
Wrong, 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 wrong.
That's the typical arrangement for saurischian dinosaurs, but ornithischian dinosaurs are so named because their typical arrangement for the pubis is to point towards the back of the animal. And further, as we go through Coelurosauria, even in Tyrannosauria, the pubis is pointing much more down than forward. And in the Maniraptors, that Joel is calling birds, the pubis is more vertical than posterior, as you can see in Anzu, an oviraptorosaurid from North America. An animal that Joel thinks is just a bird. But then even in the more bird-like Deinonychosaurs, we start seeing a pubic bone that points a bit backwards, as in Microraptor or Velociraptor. And yet, unlike in modern birds, which lack a pubic symphysis, that is, the place where the pubic bones join in the middle, those animals do still have a pubic symphysis, differentiating them from birds. It's almost like a perfect transitional sequence.
And if we look at these feathered Maniraptors, we expect to find pubic bones that point backwards. Now this one's a little bit hard to tell. In some reconstructions, there's room for interpretation as far as what the exact angle was.
It's fun how, if you just arrange those in order of how close they are to birds in the consensus, they make for a great transitional sequence.
And so some of these there's debates about, what was the exact angle, and how far was it pointing backwards, or was it vertical? But overall, it's pretty consistent.
Is it? Because I'm seeing Coelophysis as the most basal animal on here with the most anteriorly projecting pubis, with Allosaurus and Stachyosaurus having slightly more vertically oriented pubis, then the consognathids, Sinosauropteryx and Huaxiangnathus, having more vertical ones, then Caudipteryx and Con having very vertical ones, and then getting more posterior with Microraptor, a dromaeosaur, and then slightly more posterior projecting in the almost birds Gehalornis and Cathiornis, and then basically actual crown birds having the most posterior pointing pubes. I'm not sure how much more convincing of an evolutionary sequence we could possibly have, especially since the rest of the anatomy of those animals is more and more bird-like as we go, not just the hips.
The pubic bones in the dinosaurs point forward, the pubic bones in the feathered Maniraptors, the birds, are vertical or pointing backwards.
Right, as predicted in evolution. How does he not see this?
Doesn't anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
And this is a big problem for evolution, too. An evolutionist says, additional support for a locomotor transition within Maniraptora comes from the evolution of highly retroverted pubes, that's rear-facing pubic bones, which, as previously studied, have proposed is likely to have fundamentally altered the moment arms and by inference functions of several major locomotor muscles.
Weird, because that sentence endorses this transition. It doesn't propose a problem. I wonder how Joel will twist this. Also, that same paper, linking the evolution of body shape and locomotor biomechanics in birdline archosaurs by Allen et al., published in Nature 2013, also says, quote, rather than a discrete transition from more upright postures in basal most birds, aviale, and their intermediate outgroup, Deinonychosauria, our results support the hypothesis of a gradual stepwise acquisition of more crouch limb postures across much of theropod evolution. although we find evidence of an accelerated change within the clade Maniraptora, birds and their closest relatives, such as Deinonychosaurs, end quote.
What are they saying? Basically, the whole pelvis was re-engineered between dinosaurs and birds.
No, the pelvis includes the ilium, ischium, and the pubis on both sides of the body. If the whole pelvis was changed, then they talk about the other two hip bones. But also, I'm not sure what the argument is. Is he pointing out that a paper about the evolution of birds talks about change? Well, yeah, birds evolved within Dinosauria. They would have to have changed, since basal dinosaurs aren't birds. That's rather the point of evolution?
They're completely different structures.
Nope, it's the same bones with the same muscles. They even share the strong connection between numerous sacral vertebrae and the perforate acetabulum, which are diagnostic of Dinosauria. Indeed, the avian synsacrum is preceded by numerous synsacra in multiple lineages of dinosaurs.
Which makes sense if God created these as different kinds of animals, right?
Maybe. I don't know. The problem with a theory involving an omnipotent entity is that almost anything can be said to make sense. So, that God could do a certain thing a certain way if he were real doesn't really do anything to provide evidence that he actually did anything at all.
All right, so we've got our 7 major differences between dinosaurs and birds.
Okay, I guess we're not going to get into the synsacrum or the open acetabulum with Joel. Fun how the only parts of the hip that are actually diagnostic for membership in Dinosauria are the parts of the hips that Joel skips over. Well, I'm not going to skip over them. Let's start with the simpler bit, the acetabulum. As regular viewers of my channel will know, the acetabulum is the hip socket. It's called the acetabulum because the shape of a human hip socket is kind of like a small cup that Romans used to put vinegar in, so that they could use it as a condiment when eating. In most tetrapods, humans included, the socket is a cup of bone, hence the name, which has a coating of cartilage that interfaces with cartilage on the femoral head, preventing bone-on-bone contact. Dinosaurs do things a bit differently. Instead of a cup of bone formed from the fusion of the 3 hip bones, dinosaurs have a ring of bone that is open on both sides. If you had a dinosaur hip in front of you, you could throw a dart right through one acetabulum, through the other one on the opposite side, and not hit bone. This condition is called open or extensively perforate, and it's the condition of bird acetabula too. To understand the synsacrum, we need to look at the anatomy of a vertebra. Vertebrae consist of several parts. The most obvious one is the centrum. That's the disc of the vertebra. And except in cases like the first cervical vertebrae, the last caudal vertebra, or in cases of bone fusion between vertebrae, it interfaces with the previous and next vertebra in the spine. Next comes the neural arch. This is above the centrum and it's the hole through which the spinal column passes. If someone has nerve damage as a result of a spine injury, it often involves damage to this part of the vertebrae. Above this is the neural process, which often anchors various muscles. To either side of the neural arch are the transverse processes, which also often form muscle attachments. In a synsacrum, the sacral vertebrae fuse to each other and the transverse processes fuse to the iliac crests. This is actually very common in dinosaurs, and it is universal in birds. In fact, having 3 or more sacral vertebrae with a strong attachment to the sacrum is a diagnostic criterion for dinosaurs. And birds have it. The hip of a bird is alone enough to show that birds are dinosaurs.
There's more. We've got a whole list of other things that we're going to be looking into and researching.
Brain case and inner ear. Not sure what they're going to claim about that. I'm not aware of any distinctive aspects of dinosaur brains or ears that are diagnostic, but then I'm not omniscient. Bird eggs and nesting. Well, many dinosaurs did that in a very bird-like way, so I'm not sure how that will help the case that birds aren't dinosaurs. Perching and curved claws. I mean, claw curvature isn't diagnostic for dinosaurs or birds, although it is very helpful in determining lifestyle of the animal in question. So while this is interesting, I fail to see how it could help take birds out of Dinosauria. Bird breathing. Well, that's common to tetanurans at least, and possibly all of Ornithodira, given the extensive skeletal pneumaticity of pterosaurs that is very much like that of birds. So this seems like it will further unite birds to dinosaurs. Last is bird digestion. I'm not confident we have sufficient fossil evidence for this to help or not. Well, I look forward to all the nonsense, cherry-picking, and outright lies that these so-called studies will produce.
Because there are tons of differences between dinosaurs and birds, but these are the ones we've had time to research so far.
Then he should have presented those, because the 7 he did present failed entirely to show that birds aren't dinosaurs.
So jumping back to this, you can see there's a consistent trend of blue bird traits in Avialae, Dromaeosaurs, Troodontids, Oviraptors, and even Alvarezsaurids, which are funny little birds. They remind me of kiwis.
There is a clear trend. A trend of increasingly bird-like animals as you get closer to Avialae, the widest group that usually gets called birds. Also, I don't know why Silurosauria is listed as a group here, since literally everything in this list is a Silurosaur. I don't even know what it means that they're shown as a separate category here. Also, I noticed that he said that Maniraptora are birds, but Therizinosaurs, who are Maniraptorans, are listed as being almost entirely dinosaur-like?
That's weird. That's suspicious.
And then the dinosaur family groups, Coelurosaurs, the Tyrannosaurs, the Compsognathids, Ornithomimids, and actually Therizinosaurs.
Who, by the way, do have feathers, even though he said they don't, do have a semilunate carpal, even though he said they don't. So, even within Maniraptora, and even with his word games, we have an obvious non-bird that even he can't deny. Instead, he just pretends it's not a real Maniraptoran by pretending it didn't have a semilunate carpal.
Which, some people call them like the panda bears of the dinosaurs. They're just weird.
They are weird, not sure if that makes them pandas, but whatever. One group of people who are definitely not pandas are my patrons and channel members. If you're enjoying this video, why not check out my Patreon linked above and in the description, or the channel memberships with the join button below this video. You get early access to videos like this, as well as to my super secret Discord server, which is only for supporters. And there are more perks at higher tiers.
You should look them up. I don't have time to go into them right now. They're actually in Maniraptora, but they look like dinosaurs.
Which means that his whole argument that Maniraptora is all birds kind of just fell apart. And if they're in Maniraptora but aren't birds, that makes birds a subset of Maniraptora. And if Therizinosaurs are dinosaurs, which his chart said they are, then that means that Maniraptora is a group of dinosaurs, which makes birds a group of dinosaurs. It's hard to overstate the degree to which him saying that Therizinosaurs are Maniraptoran dinosaurs destroys his entire point. This is the kind of thing a small child can understand.
So they're one of the exceptions.
I'm sorry, no, that's not how this works. If you think that some Maniraptorans are dinosaurs, then either all dinosaurs are Maniraptorans, or some dinosaurs are Maniraptorans and some aren't, but all Maniraptorans are dinosaurs. There are no other options.
And you notice there are a few exceptions here in the data. There's some greens where you'd expect to be blues, and there's some blues where you'd expect to be greens.
Kind of like what you'd see if birds evolved from dinosaurs.
And our researchers have done a ton of work looking into every single one of those exceptions in that data set.
I look forward to reading the results in the Answers Research blog.
And it seems like either there's a good reason for it, like, oh, it's a flightless bird, so it doesn't have quite as much of that reinforced shoulder.
Which, if that's the argument he's going with, he can't then really use that shoulder condition as one of his criteria for being a bird. But either way, he hasn't actually shown that having a bird-like shoulder girdle is a reason birds aren't dinosaurs. So now it fails on both ends. It always failed to show that birds aren't dinosaurs, but now apparently can't even show that an animal is a bird in the first place, at least not reliably.
Or there's just biased interpretation or bad data.
Yes, the data that show him to be wrong are biased. How convenient and science-like. Ignoring contrary evidence or dismissing it is definitely not a sign of pseudoscience.
All right, so our hypothesis. God only created feathers on birds. What do you guys think?
Well, first, your hypothesis contains an unsupported assumption, that God created any organisms in particular at all. And second, since Joel has already defined anything without branching feathers as not feathers, and those animals with feathers as birds, we can't even assess the hypothesis. He's contrived this to only have one possible answer if we accept his terms and his God hypothesis. I do neither.
Seems like it was correct. From all the evidence we have so far. So could God have created birds on dinosaurs? Yeah, he could have.
Making the God hypothesis untestable and not scientific, even if it's true.
Did he? We don't have any evidence of it yet.
Which is the same amount of evidence that they found that he created birds with feathers.
So probably not.
I agree. God probably didn't create any non-birds with feathers.
All right. Now the big question I'm sure everybody is curious about. What about the raptors?
I'll be honest, that wasn't one of my questions, but he's already said that Microraptor was a bird, and that's a dromaeosaur, so I would think that his conclusion would be that raptors are birds. They're actually about as close to Aviale as you can get, and Aviale is the group that are usually called birds, even though I wish they weren't.
Let's talk about raptors. I really enjoy these movies, the Jurassic movies. They're really fun. Like Brian said, I've been a dinosaur lover since I was a kid, so I've seen them all in theaters, and I really enjoy them. The raptors from the Jurassic movies were actually based on two animals called Deinonychus and Utahraptor.
Incorrect. Velociraptor was based on Deinonychus and was the size of Utahraptor, but that was just a coincidence. Utahraptor was described in January of 1993 by James Kirkland. Pre-production for Jurassic Park began in August of 1990, with production starting in August of 1992. That means that in the 34 or so months of pre-production, production, post-production, and the lead-up to release, Utahraptor was only known about for the last 6 months. Indeed, post-production started in November of 1992 and only lasted until May of 1993. That means that in order to base the Velociraptor from Jurassic Park on Utahraptor, the change in design would have to have taken place entirely during post-production from January to May 1993. This would mean that they would have had to go back and reshoot any scenes with the Raptor costumes that had been produced during pre-production, as well as changing any rendered assets at a time when a single CGI frame could take about a day to produce. It is impossible that the Jurassic Park Raptors were based on Utahraptor.
So I'm going to talk about them briefly. And the movies promote a common misconception, and that is that we find dinosaurs like this.
Articulated dinosaurs are found. Look at Black Beauty or the Fighting Dinosaurs. But it's very unusual.
All together, articulated, beautifully fossilized. That doesn't happen very often.
Fair play to Joel. He did say that it's uncommon, and I thought he was going to say that it doesn't happen. He is correct about this.
So let's talk about Utahraptor. The yellow bones are what they found for Utahraptor in the beginning.
Okay.
That's it. Now, they've supposedly found some additional ones since then, but they haven't published anything about them, really. We don't have good descriptions for them.
It's true that the results aren't currently published, but they definitely found more bones. That's not in dispute that I'm aware of. But it also doesn't really matter much to the question about Jurassic Park raptors. I'm honestly not sure what the point of talking about Utahraptor is at all.
And they were found in just this big heap of bones of a bunch of different species, and it's hard to tell, well, what was Utahraptor and what wasn't, so that's probably why they haven't published much on it. Here's the drawings of the bones from the actual original paper. But that doesn't stop them from creating a reconstruction in a museum like this.
Yep, that's the Utahraptor reconstruction at the Brigham Young University Museum of Paleontology. In fact, this is an official photo from BYU taken by Jaron Wilkie, and it's featured as the first picture on the Wikipedia page for Utahraptor.
So how do they do that? Well,
after determining that it is a dromaeosaur in the first place, by doing things like looking at the hypertrophied pes digit 2 ungule, characteristic of dromaeosaurs, and then using its proportions to scale up a generalized dromaeosaur skeleton. That's all this is. It's a scaled up generic dromaeosaur, or raptor. That's the best you can do with such fragmentary remains.
they look at the animals that were more primitive than it, supposedly, and the animals that were more advanced than it, supposedly, that they do have better fossil evidence for, and they create a reconstruction based on their story.
Nope, they can just look at other raptors. Like, imagine if you found bits of a cat skull from one otherwise unknown cat species. We know that cats have distinctive ears that are diagnostic for Felidae, just like raptors have distinctive claws. And we'll say that this cat skull preserves at least one of the ears, so you know it's a cat. How would you reconstruct this unknown cat? Well, you'd reconstruct it as a generic cat of a size appropriate to the skull bits you found. Is that an accurate reconstruction? Well, it'll be mostly accurate, since it's not like cat skeletons vary wildly. But it won't be completely accurate, since they're all unique in some way, and your reconstruction doesn't represent that. So what, though?
Deinonychus, that's Utahraptor. We don't even have enough bones to know what Utahraptor was at this point.
Yes, we do. We have teeth and the killer claw from Utahraptor. Dromaeosaurs have distinctive claws and teeth. If we have those, we can say it's a dromaeosaur.
The yellow bones are what they found for Utahraptor in the beginning. That's it. Now, they've supposedly found some additional ones since then, but they haven't published anything about them, really. We don't have good descriptions for them. And they were found in just this big heap of bones of a bunch of different species, and it's hard to tell, well, what was Utahraptor and what wasn't, so that's probably why they haven't published much on it, whether it was a bird or a dinosaur, right?
No, we can definitely say that it was a dinosaur and not a bird.
So, if you love the idea that the raptors in Jurassic Park were real, and you want to say, oh, Utahraptor looked like that, go for it.
Looked like what? Naked raptors? I mean, they definitely didn't. We already know that they had feathers based on things like Microraptor and the quill knobs known for Velociraptor. The fragmentary nature of Utahraptor does nothing to change that, especially since the Jurassic Park raptors weren't based on it in the first place.
That's all I have to say about that.
So nothing useful to the discussion. That's what I've come to expect.
Deinonychus. Dr. Haynes has done a ton of research on Deinonychus.
Ah yes, the woman who couldn't understand Linnaeus and didn't know what a Pygostyle is. Telling me she's done research on a dinosaur and that you're going to base what you're about to say about it on her work doesn't exactly instill confidence in the coming statements.
And she's talked about how these specimens were found 50 million years apart, 30 miles apart, 30 years between expeditions. There's all these different, and that's true of even just the skull bones that they found. They didn't find an articulated skull.
As is typical, many dinosaur species are known from multiple partial skeletons.
They found a bone here, a bone there, a bone here, a bone there, none of them all together, and they put this skull together and said, I think it looks like this.
Yeah, and they did it with the benefit of decades of expertise in comparative anatomy and dinosaur anatomy specifically.
Same thing with the rest of the body.
Notice how most of the bones are known from both specimens, meaning that we know it's a single species. Meaning we can absolutely combine the specimens to get a good picture of the entire skeletal anatomy of Deinonychus.
So this brings up a really important point, and that's these words articulated versus associated. So, anybody here like to do puzzles?
I'm not a huge fan of jigsaw puzzles, but I do like many kinds of puzzles, and really, I do like jigsaw puzzles just fine. I'm just not a real big fan. I'm like a small fan.
I like puzzles. My family likes puzzles. And so, you get a brand new puzzle from the store. You open the box, and you rip the bag open, and you're digging through the pieces. You know those pieces that come from the factory already together? Those are articulated. All right, they're already together. You know that they belong together because they're connected.
Yep, sometimes the die doesn't cut all the way through the card.
Right? So those are articulated. Those are the best fossils to find because we know these bones, two bones went together. The rest of the pieces, they're just associated. They're in the same box, right?
Right, but we know they go together because they fit together. Much like what happens in vertebrate paleontology all the time. Scientists actually check the fit of associated bones to see if they can fit together. And sure, we don't always have all the bones to check, but just like if you took a couple hundred pieces out of a 1,000-piece puzzle, you could still tell that the puzzle went together, and even what the picture is, that still works in paleontology, even when some of the bones are missing.
Now, imagine you're doing 10 different puzzles all at the same time in the same living room. Some of you puzzle makers just had a panic attack.
Okay, I'm imagining it. Also, why the hell are we seeing another AI-generated image? Joel couldn't just dump some puzzles on his floor and table? He had to use AI to generate a shitty image with incomprehensible pillows, outsized puzzle pieces, books with not actual writing on their spines, and whatever the hell that abomination is on the table? Elect me as 48th President of the United States, and I'll make the use of generative AI punishable by death. Actually, don't do that. I won't accept the job. I don't want to be president.
No, I can't do it. Some piece is going to get lost, right?
Yeah, probably, and guess what? That won't really matter much to figuring out what the picture is on any of the puzzles.
So that's what paleontology is like, right? You've got all these different animals fossilized all around the world, and you're trying to associate these bones together to figure out which ones went with which animal.
And like with jigsaw puzzles, you can check by seeing if they fit. And you have the added advantage of having other people who want you to be wrong checking. And if they can't show you you're wrong, then guess what? You have a strong reason to think that you're right.
And if you leave the puzzles out long enough, your kids are traipsing through the living room, pieces are going to get mixed up. This puzzle's pieces are going to be near the other puzzle pieces. But in general, they should be kind of close to the same area where you started it. That's kind of like the evolutionary assumption of how fossils are.
Oh, I suppose that is in opposition to the flood model. I wonder what the flood model predicts.
The animal died there, its bones are kind of scattered around the same area. That's their assumption because that's their worldview.
Right, so what's the alternative?
Now imagine a giant flood comes through your living room. You got waves crashing everywhere, water swirling around, and then the water all goes away. Would you have any idea which piece went with which puzzle?
Yes, by checking for the fit. Also, I guess now we know why he wanted to do AI, because he didn't want to flood his own room. I guess that's fair, but it's also clearly not the same room, just another one generated with the same prompt. AI sucks so much. I'm sorry for subjecting you to it.
No, you'd have no idea.
Wrong.
That's the creationist worldview with paleontology.
Okay, well, since creationists don't really do paleontology, I don't care.
When we find a bone, and it's mixed with some other bones, do we know it's the same animal?
Does Joel? No, I doubt it. Do scientists? Well, at least sometimes, yes. Not always because you can't always find the bones it connects to, but even then you can check to see if it's consistent with other animals in the same taxon. For example, if you found a tibia, a femur, and a dentary bone, and a rib all identical to those of bison, and all from an animal that would have been the same size, it's reasonable to conclude that you found the fragmentary remains of a single bison individual.
No. Not unless it was articulated and they were connected and you could tell it was the same animal.
Still wrong.
And so it's really hard.
That's what she said.
And that's why when we find something like this, it puzzles evolutionists and creationists who are like, oh, that's exactly what we'd expect from a worldwide flood.
There's nothing puzzling about this. These bones are from the Dinosaur National Monument. They are numerous vertebrae, ribs, and long bones, some of which look like sauropod bones. It's part of the Jurassic Morrison Formation, almost none of which physically even can be flood rock, with some of it even being aeolian, that is, wind deposited.
It's a whole jumble of bones, right? This is Dinosaur National Monument.
Yeah, bones get jumbled. Things happen like decay and scavenging before preservation.
So, and that's another reason paleontologists are so excited when they find something like this. It's a fully articulated animal, all fossilized together. And so, as we've done our research, we've based these criteria and this research on articulated animals first. We wanted to figure out, okay, if it's right with, if the data we're looking at is correct on the articulated animals, which it most likely is, then when we look at the disarticulated animals, we'll have a better chance of being right.
Convenient way to throw out data, I guess.
Pop quiz. I know Brian said there wouldn't be any more pop quizzes today, but I've got one for you. All right. I want you to take the 7 criteria we talked about.
Okay, the 7 things that did nothing to even attempt to show that an animal isn't a dinosaur. Got it.
All right, feathers, swivel wrist, the shoulder, the short tail, the knee walking, the hip structure, and we're going to evaluate an animal. And I want you guys to tell me whether you think it was a dinosaur or a bird. Okay? All right, here we go. Let's look at the wrist. Does this look like a dinosaur wrist?
Yes, in a bird wrist, the carpals and metacarpals would be fused into a carpometacarpus, meaning that while this is a dinosaur wrist, as are all bird wrists, this is not a bird wrist.
That bends and grasps, or does it look like a swivel wrist that swivels sideways? What do you think? Swivel wrist. Good. Shoulder. Is that an angled shoulder, or is that just that continuous scapulocoracoid?
There is an angle, like in many dinosaur coracoids. This is just a dinosaur shoulder. In fact, the strap-like scapula is a characteristic trait of tetanurans, which means that specifically, this is one of the stiff-tailed theropods.
It's the angled shoulder, right. Let's look at the hips. So Microraptor and Archaeopteryx, those are their hips. Our animal that we're looking at.
Well, they all have open acetabula, so all of these are obviously dinosaur hips.
Looks like bird hip.
Actually, none of them look like bird hips, where the pubis flares out and runs parallel more or less to the ischium. But hey, who cares about being right when you've got propaganda to push, right, creationists?
Let's look at the tail. Here's an actual photo. Around 26 tail vertebrae. Big muscle attachments? No. Looks very much like a bird.
Except the birds have Pygostyles and this doesn't. And this is in fact the tail of Velociraptor from the famous fighting dinosaur fossil. So once again, we're looking at a non-avian dinosaur, at least according to the Linnaean definition of bird, which I want to remind everyone is the definition that AIG has pushed in their own literature.
This animal that we're talking about, we haven't found feathers on it.
But we have found ulnar quill knobs, which is like saying that we haven't found preserved eyeballs, but we have found a preserved eye hole in the skull. So we know pretty well it had both eyes and feathers.
But there's an animal in the same family, around the same size, that we did find feathers on. It's very similar. And you can see giant wing feathers, big tail feathers. So, that animal is called Genuine Long. It's a pretty big animal, about the size of a big turkey. And our animal is there at the bottom. All right, what do you think?
Well, given that it has all the synapomorphies of a dinosaur, and not all those of a bird, I'm going to say that it is a non-bird dinosaur, in that it is not a member of Aves. But of course, Joel has simply redefined bird to mean Maniraptoran, except when he says so. I'm going to guess he'll conclude that this is a bird based on his inconsistent word games.
Raise your hand if you think our animal was a dinosaur.
Well, that should be everyone.
Raise your hand if you think our animal was a bird.
Thanks to Joel for reminding me that if you lie to a credulous audience, you can get them to believe the lies. Not that here in 2025 we actually need such a demonstration. We've had plenty of them in the last decade or so.
That animal is Velociraptor.
Yeah, it's not hard to figure out since he used one of the most famous Velociraptor specimens in the entire world.
I didn't call Velociraptor a bird, you just did.
No, I didn't, because I can see through his lies, because I actually bothered to learn a thing or two about the subjects like what a dinosaur is, what a bird is, and most importantly, the most basic babytown shit about set theory.
Don't tell anybody that I called Velociraptor a bird.
I mean, this is going up to my thousands of subscribers, so I guess I am telling people that.
Here is a beautifully articulated fossil specimen of Velociraptor fighting a dinosaur, the Protoceratops. So we know it's not the associated problem. It's not just a bag of bones that were found together. So I don't know what to say. I'm sorry if I crushed some of if I killed your favorite dinosaur.
Nope, Velociraptor has never been my favorite dinosaur, and Joel can't kill it, because they've all been dead since before he was born, and he didn't do anything to even hint that it's not a dinosaur, except just not understand how taxonomy works.
Velociraptor may have been a bird. That's all I can say. We haven't found feathers on it yet. Maybe we will someday. We'll see.
Nope, because by the classical Linnaean definition that Gabriella Haynes loves so much, it's not a dinosaur because it had the wrong shaped tail, body, and it had teeth. Plus, it lacks virtually all of the synapomorphies that define aves, and nothing about Joel playing word games changes that.
All right, so if we look at all of the feathered Maniraptors, the ones we actually find with real feathers, branching structures, there's only about 15 or so of them.
I'm noticing some very not posterior-oriented pubes in that bunch, just saying.
There's over 100 species in Maniraptor and in those families, but only 15 or so have actually been found with feathers.
I mean, only if you use his intentionally dishonest definition for feathers, but okay.
And one of the things that confuses us is how these animals are presented. Because if you look at them like that, they kind of look like dinosaurs, right?
Yeah, but only because they have the actual anatomy of dinosaurs, something no amount of posing will change.
But if you strip away all the assumptions and just look at the bones and repose those bones based on the things that we talked about, with wings that can fold and legs that had that knee that was closer to the center of balance, and then you put the feathers back on,
they still look like dinosaurs. And I noticed that he's also just adding beaks where we know they didn't have one. So just doubling down on the lies. And I know it's a lie because he himself in his paper cited a source on how to tell if animals have beaks, and the animals in this picture mostly don't fit those criteria, except for a few, like Caudofemoralis, which actually did have a beak. Once again, I guess lying is okay if you're lying for Jesus.
They look a lot like birds, don't they?
Yeah, most of them are paravians, the group of animals that's really close to being birds. So we'd expect them to look like birds, and they'd still look a lot like birds without the fake beaks that he's added for no reason except propagandistic reasons.
The evolutionary worldview affects the interpretations and the images that represent these animals too. So when you see an image of an extinct animal, don't just take it at face value. You need to dig a little deeper sometimes and ask some questions about it.
Just don't pretend that word games and lies are going to be enough to counter the consensus. But hey, that's it. After that, it's just wrap-up stuff from Joel, and I don't have anything to say about that. I'd say that this whole thing was a disappointment. But honestly, this is what I've come to expect from creationists on this subject. All we got was wordplay and lies without even the barest attempt to show what a dinosaur is. Which should be the first step to saying that something isn't one. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. And if you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Thurrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elron Teller, Ian Chen, Calvin Brostick von Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Edwin M., North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.